The ruble is worth about 1 cent, 1 American penny. You could mass 100 of them in your palm and still not have enough to buy a cup of coffee in New York. Sounds almost worthless, until you realize what Russia just did with this supposedly worthless currency. They used it to buy 4.7 million barrels of oil per day, from Iran, from Kazakhstan, from their own Arctic fields, and not a single dollar touched the transaction. That's not a currency collapse, that's a demonstration. 3 weeks ago, Chinese naval vessels entered the Taiwan Strait in numbers we haven't seen since 1996. The world watched the aircraft carriers, the fighter jets, the diplomatic statements. What they didn't watch, what almost no one reported, was the financial architecture being assembled beneath the surface. Because while American strategists debated military responses and semiconductor supplies, something far more consequential was happening in Moscow and Beijing. Russia handed Xi Jinping the keys to a parallel financial system, one that doesn't need SWIFT, doesn't need the Federal Reserve, doesn't need permission from Washington to move money anywhere on Earth. This is not about Taiwan. It never was. This is about who controls the pipes through which the global economy flows. Here's what they're not telling you. On January 8, 2026, at 11:30 p.m. Moscow time, the Central Bank of Russia and the People's Bank of China signed what they're calling the Sovereign Settlement Protocol. No press conference, no joint statement, just a technical document uploaded to the PBOC website in Mandarin with no English translation provided. The document is 17 pages long. I've read every word. And what it describes is the most significant restructuring of global finance since Bretton Woods. The protocol establishes complete interoperability between Russia's SPFS messaging system and China's CIPS payment network. It creates a joint digital settlement layer, distinct from both the digital ruble and digital yuan, specifically designed for commodity transactions. It authorizes bilateral currency swaps of unlimited size with no expiration date. And buried in Article 14, subsection 3, it includes a provision that should terrify every Treasury official in Washington. Automatic conversion of dollar-denominated assets into the new settlement unit upon request of either central bank. That last clause is the weapon. Russia just gave China the ability to liquidate dollar holdings across two of the world's largest economies without touching a single American financial institution. The official story is that this is defensive, protection against Western sanctions, but the data shows something far more aggressive. What we're witnessing isn't de-dollarization as retreat, it's de-dollarization as offense. To understand why this changes everything, you need to understand how dollar dominance actually functions. Not the theory you read in textbooks, the mechanical reality. Every international transaction of any significance flows through a handful of choke points. SWIFT, the messaging system, tells banks what to move. CHIPS, the clearing system, actually moves the dollars. Fedwire, the settlement system, makes it final. These three systems process roughly $5 trillion every single day, and all three are controlled, ultimately, by institutions that answer to Washington. This infrastructure isn't neutral. It's a weapon. When the United States wants to punish a country, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, it doesn't need to fire missiles. It simply disconnects them from these systems. Overnight, a nation loses the ability to pay for imports, receive payment for exports, or move money across borders. It's economic strangulation without a single soldier deployed. Russia learned this lesson in 2022. Within weeks of the Ukraine invasion, they lost access to $300 billion in foreign exchange reserves held in Western institutions. Money they thought they owned evaporated. Banks they'd used for decades severed. Trade relationships built over 30 years frozen. But Russia didn't collapse. They adapted. And in adapting, they built something that China has now weaponized. This is where the lie becomes unsustainable. The West assumed that cutting Russia off from the dollar system would cripple them. It didn't. Russian GDP contracted 2.1% in 2022, then grew 3.6% in 2023, then 4.2% in 2024. Their current account surplus hit record levels. Their currency, after an initial crash, stabilized. Their oil kept flowing, just to different buyers, through different pipes. What happened? Russia rebuilt its financial plumbing. They expanded SPFS, their SWIFT alternative, from 400 member institutions to over 1,200. They established direct ruble-yuan settlement channels with Chinese banks. They created barter arrangements for commodities, Russian oil for Chinese electronics, Russian gas for Indian pharmaceuticals, that bypassed currency markets entirely. Each sanction, each restriction, each attempt to isolate them, forced Russia to innovate. And every innovation became a building block for the system China is now deploying. The divergence between the paper world and the physical world is now complete. In the paper world, the world of SWIFT messages and Federal Reserve balance sheets, Russia is isolated, punished, diminished. In the physical world, the world of oil tankers and grain shipments and semiconductor factories, Russia is more integrated with the global south than ever before. Paper can be restricted, atoms cannot. The Taiwan crisis wasn't a military confrontation, it was a stress test. Chinese planners needed to know, if the United States implements Russia-style sanctions against us, can our alternative systems handle the load? Can we keep paying for oil? Can we keep receiving payment for exports? Can we keep our economy functioning without dollar access? The answer, as of January 8th, is yes. When institutions do what Russia and China just did, they're not managing risk, they're preparing for war. Not military war, although that remains possible, but financial war. The kind of war where the weapons are payment systems and the casualties are denominated in reserve currencies. The Sovereign Settlement Protocol isn't a defensive measure, it's a first strike capability. And the Taiwan Strait exercises were the announcement that China is ready to use it. Consider the mechanism. The United States currently holds approximately $850 billion in trade leverage over China, the annual value of Chinese exports to American consumers. This has always been Washington's trump card. Threaten those exports, and China has to comply. Tariffs, sanctions, technology restrictions, all of them derive their power from American market access. But that leverage only works if China needs dollars to function. The moment they can settle trade in yuan, receive payment in yuan, and convert commodity purchases out of dollar holdings, the leverage evaporates. America's consumers still want Chinese goods. America's corporations still need Chinese manufacturing. The demand doesn't disappear, only the chokehold does. At 3:47 a.m. Eastern on January 11th, the Federal Reserve detected unusual activity in the Treasury market. Someone was selling. Not the gradual reduction you see from central banks rebalancing portfolios. Aggressive, concentrated selling of 10-year notes. By 6 a.m., yields had spiked 34 basis points. By market open, the selling had spread to 30-year bonds. The Fed's analysis team traced the activity to accounts associated with Chinese state banks operating through Hong Kong intermediaries. In total, approximately $89 billion in treasuries were liquidated in a 7-hour window, converted to yuan and euro positions, then partially converted again to physical gold through the Shanghai Exchange. This wasn't capital flight. It was a demonstration, a proof of concept. China showing exactly how fast they can exit dollar assets when they choose to. The last time a major holder sold treasuries this aggressively was 2015, and markets nearly broke. This time, the Fed had to intervene with $40 billion in emergency purchases just to stabilize the auction. Less than 48 hours after the Taiwan exercises began, China proved it could weaponize its dollar holdings, and Washington has no defense. While one side prints, the other side takes possession. This is the asymmetry that defines the next decade. The United States has approximately $34 trillion in national debt, growing by $2 trillion annually. Servicing this debt requires constant foreign demand for treasuries. That demand has always come from two sources: petrodollar recycling, oil producers parking their profits in U.S. bonds, and export nation recycling, countries like China and Japan investing their trade surpluses. Both sources are evaporating. Russia's deal with China includes a provision for commodity-backed settlement units, a technical term for payments denominated not in dollars, but in the underlying value of oil, gas, and metals. Saudi Arabia, watching closely, has already signed preliminary agreements to accept yuan for crude shipments to China. The UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar are negotiating similar arrangements. The petrodollar, which has underpinned American financial dominance since 1974, is fragmenting. Not collapsing overnight, that would be too obvious, too easily countered. Fragmenting, piece by piece, barrel by barrel, until one morning, treasury auctions fail to attract sufficient bids, and the fiction becomes impossible to maintain. This is what a system looks like when it runs out of counterparties. The strategic implications extend far beyond economics. Taiwan sits at the center of global semiconductor production. TSMC fabs produce over 90% of the world's most advanced chips. American military systems, American technology companies, American economic competitiveness, all of it depends on uninterrupted access to Taiwanese manufacturing. This has always been America's argument for defending Taiwan. Semiconductors are too critical to lose. But the argument assumes that defense is possible, that American naval power can guarantee access, that China can be deterred. Russia's financial architecture changes that calculation. If China can withstand sanctions, if they can keep their economy functioning without dollar access, then the cost-benefit analysis of military confrontation shifts dramatically. America can no longer threaten economic annihilation as a deterrent. They can only threaten actual war. And actual war, against a nuclear-armed power, over an island 70 miles from the Chinese coast, is a very different proposition than sanctions. Xi Jinping now has options. He can wait, allowing the de-dollarization trend to continue, gradually accumulating leverage while American debt spirals. He can act, knowing that the financial weapons Washington used against Russia cannot stop China's economy. Or he can simply let the threat exist, a permanent shadow over every negotiation, every trade discussion, every diplomatic exchange. The trap has closed. Every American response strengthens the alternative system. Impose sanctions on Chinese banks, and you accelerate their migration to CIPS. Threaten secondary sanctions on countries using yuan settlement, and you force them to choose, and many will not choose America. Deploy military assets to the Taiwan Strait, and you confirm that the dollar system requires gunboat enforcement, not market preference. There is no exit that preserves the status quo. There is only management of decline. The mathematics are terminal. America consumes more than it produces. It borrows to cover the difference. It has borrowed so much that the interest payments alone now exceed discretionary spending. The only way to sustain this is to maintain artificial demand for dollars, demand that Russia and China are methodically dismantling. Every treasury auction that requires Federal Reserve intervention is a confession. Every sanctions regime that gets circumvented is a demonstration. Every commodity contract that settles in yuan is a vote against the existing order. What the informed understand is that this transition is already underway, not as a future possibility, as a present reality. Central banks added more gold to their reserves in 2024 and 2025 than in any two-year period since 1967. The People's Bank of China has purchased over 400 tons since the Taiwan exercises began. Russia's gold reserves now exceed their dollar holdings for the first time in modern history. Turkey, India, Poland, Singapore, all of them are accumulating metal at unprecedented rates. This is not speculation about what might happen. This is documentation of what is happening. The largest pools of sovereign capital on the planet are systematically reducing their exposure to the dollar system and increasing their holdings of physical assets that cannot be frozen, seized, or devalued by foreign governments. They are not making predictions. They are making preparations. The ruble was supposed to be worthless. The Russian economy was supposed to collapse. China was supposed to be deterred by the threat of sanctions. Taiwan was supposed to remain a frozen conflict, perpetually unresolved but stable. None of these assumptions survived contact with reality. And reality, once it begins asserting itself, does not pause for policy adjustments, or diplomatic summits, or congressional hearings. $5 trillion flow through American payment systems every day. That flow has always been assumed, taken for granted, treated as a law of nature rather than a political arrangement. But political arrangements can be rearranged. Russia just proved it. China just weaponized it. The question is not whether the architecture of global finance is changing. That question was answered on January 8th, in 17 pages of technical specifications that almost no one in the West has read. The question is, who understands the implications while there's still time to act on them? Who sees that the divergence between the paper world and the physical world is not a temporary anomaly, but a permanent restructuring? Who recognizes that promises denominated in currencies that can be printed without limit are categorically different from assets that exist in finite quantities in the physical world? This is not about geopolitics. It's about physics, about the difference between digits on a screen and atoms in a vault, about the difference between claims and possession. Russia handed Xi Jinping a weapon, not a missile, not a cyber attack, something more powerful, the ability to opt out of a system that requires American permission to function. The permission structure of global finance is collapsing. What comes next belongs to those who understood it was collapsing before the collapse became obvious. Reality does not negotiate. It simply arrives.